Trump Pope. He was ushered in as a compromise to not make things too evidently going on the Jesuit side, but he's still a Jesuit candidate. He's an Augustinian, just like Martin Luther, because he's going to be the one who wants to actually go the other way and unify Christians after the Vatican has published a document which I talked about in this book last June about the synodality and the necessity to really step down from their primacy role, from their superior role as with the Pope or the Bishop of Rome having this papacy, which in reality, like they admitted themselves, was an artificial construct amongst the first Christian communities. So they want to usher in, as you know, the one world religion, and the papacy seems at this point almost an impediment. So the fact that they brought an Augustinian, I think, is very important, as well as the fact that this guy has been most of his life out of the United States. In fact, Dolan didn't even know who this guy was at one point. He had coffee with him, but he was in Peru, the place, one of those places which we have discussed in the past in relation to Pachamama, and
the mafia, because of the Yakuza with Fujimura, right? So the whole thing.
Well, back to the Catholics. Some connections there, but I think that the main connection that he has is, of course, with the Jesuits, because South and Central America have been forever Jesuit territory. So I want to welcome everybody who has just tuned in, because I think that today is almost like the day after, especially for us here, Americans. We have seen all those people who in St. Peter's Square started to chant, USA, USA, an American flag. And a lot of people say, oh, but then Trump maybe has, bribed his way through the conclave. And I think we are totally the other way, the opposite way. I mean, Trump would have probably done much better with some other candidates, as this one is blatantly anti-Trump, and he has been tweeting, like the New York Post said, retweeting for years anti-Trump stuff from the very early stages of Trump's primaries in the first election till now. So he's been really very critical of Trump, of his immigration policies, but also about many other issues that regard Donald J. Trump. So of course, the left is all happy, and they are like chanting, oh, wow, we have finally a great successor for Pope Francis, and he's even an American. Oh, this is great. And of course, then, you have them saying, oh, well, MAGA is furious, is getting upset because of the anti-Trump views that were expressed by this Pope when he was still a cardinal, or even earlier when he was a bishop. We can say that these anti-Trump views are pretty evident. I mean, he's very much a Marxist. The USA Today entitled an article this morning, is Pope Leo XIV a woke Marxist Pope? And then the answer was, he is if you are a Trump supporter.
Right, yeah, because it seems like he's being presented on one hand as a Republican and a mathematician, and on the other hand, they're not really holding accountable that he's been very open borders. He's all about open borders, and he's anti-immigration.
This guy has been promoting articles critical of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. Like I said, he has expressed sympathy for George Floyd. He has nothing that really we can say in any way is positive for Trump or his administration. However, Trump, of course, had to be very diplomatic. It's like you need to understand that he's also a head of state. It's not only the head of a religion. And he might be a woke pope, but he is still an American, though he has dual citizenship with Peru, but he's still an American. So as an American, if you have the first pope made in the Vatican, you have to pretend at least diplomatically to, in fact, the words of Trump were quite encouraging in that sense. Now, this morning there was the American Cardinal Conference for the journalists, the press conference for the journalists. So I followed the whole thing from Rome. You know, in the audience, there were the usual people like Lester Holt and all those mainstream guys. And so I followed the whole thing. And of course, we are talking about the first American Pope, but we're also talking about somebody who has grown within the missions abroad, especially in South America, and especially in particular in Peru, like I said. And he has been very much pro-immigration, open borders, very much also in defense of the Venezuelans. And we know that the Venezuelan immigration, unfortunately, also has been a problem with all those gang members and so on. Right. So it is a little bit, to say the least, controversial, the fact that this is an American Pope, because it is almost like the choice was made to wage a daily psyop war upon Americans and upon the Trump administration.
Right. And it's also interesting because of, I mean, the Pizzagate aspect to this, just that, you know, the Catholic Church and any sort of human trafficking and treatment of children by pedophiles,
okay.
Right? He's been protecting them, arguably.
That this guy has been covering up for acts of pedophilia.
Yeah.
You see, when he was, for example, also involved with the Augustinian order in Chicago, he apparently covered up for a case there, but apparently there is also other cases that he covered later on. So
even more recently in Peru. So it seems like he gets in trouble for covering up in America. He has to go to live in Peru because that's what they do. They move you around, right? If you're doing this, they hide you in some other place, some other town, eventually some other country. But now there's cases in Peru. So he's everywhere he goes, even into 2024, there are cases of him hiding it, which is pretty crazy.
He has been accused, definitely, and quite openly, of being one of those candidates to the papacy that had the past that could come back to haunt them. Now, in regards to the way this conclave was going, in the end, like I said, he was chosen because, of course, the Jesuits had these candidates that they had their own approval, and amongst them there was, of course, this guy who out of nowhere was brought to Rome, was made cardinal. Eventually this year was even given the seat of cardinal bishop, which means, you know, like when you are a general, you have various stars, no? And this is like the ultimate cardinal when you have also that kind of recognition for Pope Francis, who has prepared the way for him to arrive to become the Pope. It's quite clear from a study of his career that is not simply a guy that comes out of nowhere like they claim. He had the support of Pope Francis all the way, and he had the support of the Jesuits, who started to talk about him in very, you know, promising terms in publications like America, the Jesuit Review, which I talk about in my book, is a very important publication for, you know, presenting people within the Vatican hierarchy, but also for presenting political figures like, for example, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez, which had her bio appearing on America Jesuit Review in 2018 when she kind of came out of nowhere. So somebody said the wrong Leo is the Pope.
That's exactly right. Yeah. That's what I was
thinking. Now let's go back to that. I mean, in my book, I explained that Pope 13 was definitely a very different character from because at the time when I finished writing this book and the day the Pope died. And so this book is, of course, a book that explains how the Vatican has been hijacked by the Jesuits and that there was no possibility that we were turning back to the days of pre-Vatican II, like some people were hoping. And I think that also, I mean, it must have been a disappointment for a lot of conservative, traditional Catholics who still think the Latin Mass is the solution to all the problems. And I agree, it's a great thing. But it's not, unfortunately, something that is going to gather momentum in a Catholic Church that's been hijacked a long time ago by these forces which are now unified, and it's progressive Freemasonry and Jesuitism that work hand in hand to bring in gradually this one world religion. So this Pope in particular comes in, and he comes in with an experience, of course, which for them is very important, the experience in South America, because when you're talking about South America, you're talking about also the famous or infamous, depending on the points of view, Pact of the Catacombs, which was something I discussed very much in volume 7 of my Confessions. And this Pact of the Catacombs is an agreement that was signed by 42 bishops of the Catholic Church in the catacombs of Domitilla near Rome in November 1965. We were 3 weeks before the closing of the Second Vatican Council. So we were right at the end of the Vatican Council, and the people who became involved with this pact, which was almost a Marxist takeover of the church, headed by a guy called Elder Camara, who will become then the mentor of Klaus Schwab, who founded, of course, the Davos World Economic Forum, and invited him, in fact, in one of his first events to hold a speech. He is known as the he was known, because he died in 1999, as the Red Bishop, and he was very much a self-identified socialist, an advocate of liberation theology. So all these people who met in secret in this Pact of the Catacombs were from South America, and they were pushing, this liberation theology. And there was, of course, a variety of bishops from Brazil, from Panama, there was also a North American bishop, by the way, I think from Quebec, so from Canada, but Canada is pretty left. It's pretty on the left. Right. And so there was various people associated with the liberation theology, and the document that was produced in these catacombs and was never mentioned publicly at the time, resurfaced later on during the papacy of Pope Francis, because these people were very influential in the life and in the work of Pope Francis. You see, like I explained in my book, after the Second Vatican Council, it wasn't that suddenly the church switched modality and turned to Marxism and to a mix of communism and Catholicism, which is the case now. There were initially those conservative forces. We have talked many times, for example, about the P2 Lodge. Now, in this book, I explain also with the testimony of the late Licio Gelli, the worship master of the P2, how Argentina was a key place, like other places in South America, of course, connected to the Operation Condor and all the rest, but it was connected to the branching out of the P2 Lodge in South America. And Jorge Mario Bergoglio would be eventually initiated in Freemasonry, and that led to him arguing with the Jesuit, the superior general of the time, Padre Rupe, who was a Marxist, who didn't like really the P2 and the dictatorships that led in Argentina in particular to the dirty war, the desaparecidos and all that. So Jorge Mario Bergoglio, for a moment, sided more with Freemasonry and the conservative side of Freemasonry, and was helped by them to establish himself later in the early 90s as a bishop, eventually becoming the Bishop of Buenos Aires. But then there was a moment in which he got back into the fold with the Jesuits, and that was, like I explained in my book, when he refused the offer of Ratzinger to become the commissioner of the Jesuits, because both John Paul II as well as Joseph Ratzinger were conservative and understood the danger that the Jesuits posed.
Liberation theology, right?
But not only that, the Jesuits in general had all these crazy ideas, which are now the ideas of the left, the climate change, everything that this new Pope is pushing forward is part of the Jesuit ideology. And so I had announced in the weeks prior to this election that, of course, it will not be formally a Jesuit, because that would be too obvious. It would be another order. But also I explain, like I explain in my book, that the Jesuits infiltrate every single religious order in the Catholic Church, so they can actually, because they are the ones in charge of the most influential educational facilities, seminaries, colleges, universities, and they have been for a very long time because that's their mission. So when we encounter a pope who is from, yes, nominally is from America, but in reality he has this very strong history with South America. We have to understand that the Second Vatican Council had a South American follow-up in 1968. The Second Vatican Council terminated in December 1965. But at that point, in 1968, in Medellin, Colombia, out of all places, the church put together what is known as the Second Episcopal Conference of Latin America. And that was when liberation theology and other elements that associated, the communism with Christianity were incentivized even more.
Right.
And I explain also how the Jesuits themselves, through certain people, and especially here I mention certain figures within the Jesuits, published books also actually to encourage the interpretation of a Jesus viewed as a communist.
Totally. Yeah. And the idea like that, there would be no, it's so communist. It's weird because it hits like that anti-family nucleus Bolshevik style. The idea that everyone would have no parents, but we'd all be fathers and altar boys. I mean, it's a complete Marxist society, and they started pushing it really hard, like Alberto Romero, right?
Well, if we want to go to the origins of communism and Jesuitry in South America, we have to go much further back in what are known as the reductions, which was an experiment that the Jesuits conducted with the Guarani people in South America, known as the reducciones, and this happened between 1609 and 1767 in South America, and that was really the roots of what inspired later on Jewish communism, Judeo-Bolshevism, and everything else. I mean, people, of course, blame and like to blame always the Jew, because the Jesuits were very clever in trying to then find an scapegoat, and they managed to find it. But in reality, the Jesuits first established, they dedicated the first community to the Madonna of Loreto, the second to Saint Ignatius. They were, of course, very much into working with these natives and experimenting something different. Now, what was this something different? It was a community in which nobody really possessed anything. Of course, you're talking about communism, no? But the fields they cultivated, the livestock which provided the food, the clothes, the arms, the tools they work with, they were all part of what was known as the Tupam Bak. And in this vision of things, a Christian could dispose of his time and person freely, but the Jesuit fathers, let's say, were presiding over the natives, who were, of course, treated almost as livestock in a way, though they might have been, they prohibited severely the natives from, for example, trading with what they define as the corrupt Creoles. The Guaranis had this friendly intercourse with the Jesuits that ended up in this experimentation. Now, was this experimentation good or bad? Now, if you go and see the film The Mission, you remember that film, then the Jesuits are, of course, portrayed as the heroes, because they are always portrayed by Hollywood as the heroes. But in reality, the children of Paraguay knew no other authority than the good Jesuit fathers, and they were kept by these Jesuit fathers under their control. And this control was not necessarily of a democratic nature. I mean,
totally a Jesuit republic, theocracy, right?
Yes, the Jesuit fathers were there, and of course they provided some entertainment and recreation for the Guarani Indian Christians. But the thing is that the Guaranis were, like, for example, as soon as a girl was 14 and a boy was 16 years of age, they would be married by the Jesuits,
right?
Who were, of course, anxious they don't fall in carnal sin. Then they were, none of them could become a Jesuit or a priest of these people. They were just part of the workers of the fields. They were not ever brought or elevated to become they themselves a Jesuit or a priest.
So by the 17th century and the 18th century, Jose Francia was in charge of Paraguay. And so they made laws that forced people to not be with their own kind. So if you were a Guarani, you couldn't marry a Guarani. If you were Spaniard, you couldn't marry a Spaniard. You had to mix because they were trying to make a Jesuit Paraguayan republic where everyone was kind of mixed between each other, right? And so they were trying to basically create the Hispanic Latino population as a way of disassociate or just disconnecting the Guarani from their native tradition. It seemed like that was
at one point process. Though, because of the Jesuit suppression that started in the 1760s, and started in France, in Spain, in Portugal. Yeah. Then at that point, the Guarani missions, by order of the king, who was at the time the Spanish King Charles II, ended all these Paraguayan reductions that were praised from the future communists as the social utopia or Christian communistic.
And they killed them. It's like 99% of the Paraguayans were killed by a Triple Alliance war to destroy the Jesuit Republic. So yeah, there's a crazy war between the Jesuits in the world for sure.
Well, it was also the moment in which the Jesuits, for a brief time, were eventually exposed and prohibited even by the Vatican, who rejected them formally in 1773. But having said that, the Jesuits survived. The Jesuits survived, and they survived, and not only they survived, they prospered even in America, where they were involved in Maryland, and where people like the Carroll family, and were very much involved with the establishment of this country, because they were inheritors of the land of the Calverts, the barony that was given of Maryland. The very land of the Capitol Hill where it's built was given by the Jesuits, agent Carrots, and it was this something that people don't understand today. Is like, they like to see Washington, and of course Washington is very Masonic, of course, but in reality there is also John Carroll, who was the first American bishop, who was himself a former, between brackets, Jesuits. When we say former, we talk about a suppression that in reality was not accepted by most Jesuits, who at the time, for convenience, they maybe, became secular priests, but in reality they were not, because the Jesuit general still, even when he was arrested at the time, Lorenzo Ricci, was very much in control. So in 1776, we have America in a moment in which we imagine the Jesuits being suppressed and not having really so much influence. But the first American bishop was a Jesuit. His brother, John Carroll, became John Carroll was that. Then you have his brother Daniel Carroll, who became one of the founding fathers and congressman from Maryland. Then you have the cousin also, who was, I think, another Carroll also, because there were three Carrolls. It was Daniel, John, and Charles. And Charles also had been trained in Jesuit warfare at the Society of Jesus St. Olmer's College. And he ended up also teaching at St. Olmer's. And Charles instead was studying law at the Jesuit College Louis de Grand in Paris, which Paris is, of course, at the time, they had suppressed the Jesuits, but it was considered as Jesuit stronghold. And until they suppressed the Jesuits, they were very much in charge of the educational the most prestigious educational institution. So the Jesuit College Louis le Grand in Paris was a very important one. And then he was able to undertake in London's Inner Temple further studies. And we don't really know much about Daniel Carroll's activities between 1753 and 1781, but it's known that the Carrolls were amongst the wealthiest and most powerful American, aside from being Jesuit agents, at the time of the foundation of America. So then you had Charles Carroll, who is also considered one of the founding fathers of the United States, who became a signatory to the Declaration of Independence, who was labeled by John Adams American most richest citizen. This guy is a Jesuit agent. And so, I mean, we are talking here about the foundations of America. I mean,
right. Well, I mean, the idea that also Freemasonry sort of becomes more important when
the Jesuits work hand in hand with the Freemasons. The Freemasons were always loyal to the Jesuits. I'm not saying every single Freemason was knowledgeable and aware of that, but the ones who arrived to a certain level, and that's why the actual Jesuits participated with the Freemasons in building up the high degrees, which are known as the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. Right. So this book also tells you the story of how, and this is confirmed now also by Masonic historians who have contacted me to confirm that what I wrote in the book is totally correct. So the fact that the Carrolls were involved in the District of Columbia that bore the name Rome in 1663, for those who don't know it.
Rome, right.
And the branch of the Potomac River that bordered Rome on the south was called Tiber, like the river in Rome. I mean,
the New Rome, right?
It's the New Rome. So, I mean, also those symbols you see in this beautiful place, which is, of course, the United States Congress. At times, these symbols can be of, I mean, can be confusing for some people. Why? Because they think, like, for example, the fasci litori, no? Mm-hmm. The ones that you find there on the side of the Congress, no? You have this, the fasces, how you call it? Fasces, no? The fasci litori. It's a Roman device that originates with ancient Etruscans, from who the earliest Roman derived the religious jurisprudence nearly 3,000 years ago. And it symbolizes, of course, the power of the Roman king to punish his subjects, and later, of course, the power of the magistrate and of his jurisdiction. Why were they placed there in the Congress? Well, they also are, in a way, remnants of the influence that the capital, I mean, the American capital abounds with clues of its Roman origins and the Vatican connections, aside from the Masonic clues. So often people associate all this with Freemasonry, when in reality Freemasons were working hand in hand with the Jesuits. Now, there is a Vatican artist who is called Costantino Brumidi. Have you ever heard of him?
Constantino what?
Brumidi. Now, Costantino Brumidi is a guy who painted the famous fresco you find in the Capitol Hill known as the Apotheosis of Washington. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just looking at that. Actually, have that picture open already.
Yes, and Brumidi, also known as the Michelangelo of the United States, had previously worked for Pope Gregory XVI in the Vatican for 3 years, painting the official portrait of the Pope, restoring the fresco, and he even fought for the Pope, as he said, as a captain in the civic guard authorized by Pope Pius IX. He was a Jesuit agent who fought for the Vatican, and he painted this.
So the Jesuits talking about apotheosis of Freemasons.
The Jesuits are the controllers of the Freemasons. They are the Freemasons, and the Illuminati are the Luciferian court of the Jesuits who control them. And in my book, I explain how all this happens. And at the time in which, of course, the United States was founded, it was very popular, the right of strict temporal observance, amongst other rights, and the fact that the Jesuits were hiding within Freemasonry under the title SI, Superior Inconnua, non superior, but SI means also Società Jesus, so they were Jesuits. So you see, they were very capable of hiding themselves, but they were also very much in charge of everything, just as they became in charge later on of founding everything else. I mean, people need to understand that the very history also of the United States is connected to the Jesuits. That's why I mentioned this artwork that you are showing of Costantino Brumidi. And the fact that the National State House evolved as a capital on the land which was given by the Carroll family. So, I mean, it's just like, no?
So what's the reason that there's been so many Protestant presidents and this kind of concern America's had about Catholic presidents, you know, JFK, kind of the JFK curse, and then Biden as a Catholic president? Like, what is the situation with this?
Well, of course, America is a great country that was trying in some way, to become its own country, independent from Europe and independent also from the Vatican. So they will never have accepted Jesuit influence, if not, creeping in from one side and the other. However, having a Catholic president like we had Joe Biden, he was a complete Jesuit stooge and Jesuit agent. What happened with John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who wanted to start also a dialogue with Russia and was more moderate in certain approaches, was also inspired by the Jesuits. Let's not forget that Pope Francis went and visited Raul and Fidel Castro before coming here. Let's also not forget that Raul Castro said to Pope Francis, I would have loved to be a full-on Jesuit, but he was a Jesuit of the 5th class, like Nancy Pelosi is a Jesuit of the 5th class.
And so what do you think also about Germany? Because you have the alliance with the Reich and then the switching over to the OSS and the Americans, essentially, right? Like the Catholics decided World War II.
Germany was very important from the start of Ignacio Loyola's mission. When he founded the Jesuits, he sent his first 18 disciples on an educational mission to establish their base in Ingolstadt. Ingolstadt later on became the birthplace, as you know, from the University of the Order of the Illuminati, and also one of the centers for the Age of Enlightenment. So we are talking about, though, a counter-reformation. The Jesuits were formed in 1540. This was a group of people who met together and established themselves as an order before becoming priests in Montmartre, in Paris, in France, and then later on will be accepted by the Pope in 1540, but because the Pope needed them. Even if Ignacio Loyola had been arrested prior to that by the Inquisition for having dwelled with the occult and being a member of the Alumbrados, the Illuminati of the time. So you had, of course, people are referring to the Medici. We can talk about Machiavelli. We can talk about the Prince. But the Jesuits are the ultimate Machiavellic creatures, if you want. And they were established also to bring the power of Rome into the East. And that's when Matteo Ricci went to China, Francis Xavier Japan, India, in Goa, they established an important base. The empires of Portugal and Spain were, of course, of support for all this.
Wow.
So the Jesuits were established seemingly as a religious order, but seemingly, because in reality they are a secret society, and they are also a society with secrets, because nobody really knows their relationship with the Vatican intelligence that they helped establish in the 1760s as another part of the Counter-Reformation to help fighting Queen Elizabeth I. Because you see, there was Martin Luther, of course, which is a very important element to our story, but there is also the Anglican Church, which became a very important, it inspired the Jesuits to go and fight. I mean, the Jesuits were behind Guy Fawkes. The Jesuits wanted to blow up the whole thing. The Jesuits wanted to kill Elizabeth I before that. And of course, at that point, Elizabeth I was able to create the most powerful intelligence ever established with John D. 007 and the whole show. But why? As a counterintelligence to the Jesuits. So the Jesuits were inspirational in that way. No, we will never had what today we call MI6 or MI5, the CIS, if we didn't have the Jesuits who tried to kill their queen, and on behalf, of course, of the Holy Alliance, which was the name of the first intelligence unit in the Vatican, inspired by the alliance between the Jesuits and Mary Stuart. Because for several centuries, the Jesuits tried to usher back in Catholicism into the throne of England through the Stuart family, up until the early 19th century, though eventually they gave up because, of course, it failed. But in the meantime,
the Naturalization Act, right?
Freemasonry became part of that struggle.
King James, yeah.
Well, and then you have the Jacobite, and then that's why in this book I explain the history of my family, the Lyon family, which is very important because it goes back to Scotland, to the Sinclairs. We were the main families with the Sinclairs, with the Knights Templars, because the Jesuits established themselves on let's say, ruins of the Knights Templars.
Right. Yeah. With their aesthetic. But also, I mean, so this is happening essentially after the suppression of the Jesuits begins the Freemasons' worldwide power, or how do you look at it? Like they kind
I would say that, okay, now we have the Jesuits and the Freemasons that already started to work together in a lodge called the Lodge of St. Edward in Paris. The Jacobites, as you know, had a base because they were trying with the Scottish. Then, Chevalier Ramsay became the guy who delivered that famous speech that inspired the High Degrees. But at the same time, you had Bonnie Prince Charles, you had the attempts to reacquire. So it was, let's say, in that moment that the Jesuits understood that Freemasonry that was starting to gather momentum, speculative Freemasonry from the early 18th century, late 17th century, was something that they could control if they placed maybe in the high degrees something that was captivating. And that was, of course, Neo-Templarism. And that's why all the high degrees of the various rites, like ancient anesthetic Scottish Rite, rectified Scottish Rite, Swedish, is all Templar.
Right.
All Templar, because, of course, the Jesuits at that point had a way. It's a little bit like, and I explained this, like when during the early stages of Protestantism, the Jesuits understood that Rosicrucianism was very similar to them, and they could use it and infiltrate it. Right. Rosicrucianism, people think, okay, it's born in Germany at the height of, when they're really breaking with Rome. Johann Valentin Andrea, the manifestos were obviously visibly against Rome. But at that point, the Jesuits saw an opportunity. These people are you see, Protestantism was kind of taking away all that Catholic mysticism, worship that derived from many pagan cults that were integrated at the beginning of Christianity by the Roman Empire. And of course, we were going towards pure Christianity in a way, no? But the Jesuits saw that even in those countries, there was it was almost like people were searching for more. And that's why they went towards Rosicrucianism. And so appeared a professor in the Collegium Romanum, which was the second and most important institution that now is the Pontificia Università Lateranense, where they also established their first astronomical laboratory. And in this, there was a professor called Athanasius Kircher. Now, Athanasius Kircher became very important. He was a German Jesuit, an occultist, a polymath, a teacher, who influenced the Society of Jesus, but he also influenced the birth of the Golden Rosy Cross, that became a way for the Jesuits to infiltrate the Rosicrucian movement. So Athanasius Kircher became very influential. He actually converted, because you see, the Jesuit professors are Jesuit professors in the daytime. In the nighttime, they become Jesuit agents, secret agents. No? So he went to Sweden and he managed to convert Queen Christina. And that was a big catch for the Jesuits because, a queen from a Protestant country, bring her to Rome, giving up on her throne. Now, the ability of the Society of Jesus, like I explained in my latest book, Volume 12 of my Confession, which is the culminating and the last installment of my Confession series, that brings you right there in the pyramid, around in the all-seeing eye, is to explore the occult because their constant curiosity about such matters was encouraged by the superiors, even at the height of the Inquisition that they themselves helped to implement. They took over from the Dominicans because, yes, Loyola was condemned by the Inquisition, but as soon as he was approved as an order, he said, okay, now I'm going to take over the show here. And the Pope understood that these people who were occultists, alumbrados, illuminati, and whatnot, they could be very useful in detecting and taking control of certain things, even if they were practicing occultists. Actually, that was something good for them because they said that only a practicing occultist can understand who is another practicing occultist. So Herman Castrillo was a Jesuit. He first wrote in this direction in 1736 a book called Historia di Magia Natural e Scienze della Filosofia, where he discusses astrology, physiognomy, natural magic, and even America, because America was considered a magical place. It was the early days of America. So this book shows that they're very inclined towards natural magic. But it wasn't only natural magic they were in. For example, Del Rio was a famous inquisitor who wrote Disquisitorium Magicorum a few decades there in 1599. He was actually a guy, Del Rio, who was an inquisitor, but in reality he was practicing magician. So, and Del Rio, Disquisitorium Magicorum, was all about this witchcraft, and it wasn't about alchemy, or it wasn't about something noble. Then we have, of course, Athanasius Kircher. Athanasius Kircher, with the book Oedipus Egypticus of 1652, is the one that really inspired more than any others the Illuminati of the time, because there was no Rosetta Stone, there was no interpretation of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and he started to, finally
claim he's got interpretation. Right? Yeah. Kircher was doing that. He said he knew what hieroglyph writing meant, right? And he could understand Tartarian, right? Because he could read the Chinese letters too. He could read it all, he said, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Making it up, though? I mean, so you're saying that he didn't really know how to read these things and he was just making up a new...
No. He went through very elaborate studies to give at least a partial interpretation. Of course, the Rosetta Stone is a different thing because it's completely correct 100%. You have the two writings compared, and you can go through one and the other and have the correct interpretation 100%. But remember that wasn't the case at the time. And remember one thing, Ignazio Loyola had really sent all these missionaries abroad. And apparently Athanasius Kircher, who was the professor at the Collegium Romano, which, by the way, was established on top of the biggest temple of ancient Rome of Isis, because they were worshippers of Isis, as Athanasius Kircher himself explains in his book on Egypt.
Which explains the Jesuits' obsession with worshiping the Virgin Mother, completely.
Yes, that is what I also very much explain in my book. I mean, it's about, you see, when in 1522, the whole saga of Ignazio Loyola starts. It starts in Montserrat. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in Spain, in Montserrat. I will always advise any friends to go to Montserrat, because Montserrat is a place, people go to Barcelona, okay, Barcelona, Montjuic, Tibidabo, they have fun, blah, blah, blah. But if they want to be a little bit more open and understand things, they should go to Montserrat, to the Benedictine monastery of Montserrat, because that's where the Black Mary that inspired Ignazio Loyola, and it's an incredible place, Montserrat. Put the monastery of Montserrat for a moment, which is right there, the monastery of Montserrat, and you will see one of the most fantastic locations. There, yeah. Yes, yeah. Perfect. I remember I was 16 when I went there, and my grandmother brought me there. I didn't know what to expect. She told me, I have to bring you to a very special place. I remember that my grandmother used to work for Winston Churchill during the war, translating cablograms. She was, if you go on Wikipedia, you can find incoming, as she worked for British intelligence during the war. So she was very skilled with things. It's a magical place. It's definitely a magical place. And in this place, Loyola got inspired and found, he found himself in the heart of the Basque region of Spain. That, by the way, the Basque region is not any kind of place, no?
And then he went, It's not French, it's not Spanish, it's Basque country. Right, yeah. Exactly.
And then he goes to the Benedict monastery of Santa Maria de Montserrat in March 1522. He stands in front of this blessed mother, this Black Madonna, Isis, Our Lady of Montserrat. And that's where he starts his whole adventure, that will bring him then later on, soon after, into a cave for 11 months, where he settled, doing things, working at a local at a hospital in exchange for food and lodging. He practiced asceticism, and then he prayed for 7 hours a day, and he formulated the fundamentals of his spiritual exercises, which will become the most powerful ever devised by a religious order, because then the order of of the Jesuits, the Company of Jesus as is known, or the Society of Jesus as is referred today, thanks to these exercises, built their own egregor. And they are still practiced to this day by people like Nancy Pelosi or other politicians, who every summer for at least 2 weeks they practice these exercises, which is a way to, of course, in my book I explain it's complicated. The exercises are complicated. They're not just, something simple. But in my book I try to simply discern them and explain them to the common folk.
But spiritual exercises. So I've done a few of these Jesuit spiritual exercise retreats, right, with the Jesuits.
Well, I think they are misleading towards demonic communication. You have to be just careful.
It's just kind of like what they try to do is show you how to use your senses. So Loyola was in a lot of pain after the Crusade Wars, and he was in bed, and he asked for books on sex, drugs, rock and roll, and they gave him holy books as well. And he got some spiritual meditation. He's like, I know what to do. order of light. We'll call it the Illuminati, and the Vatican's like, can you just call it the Jesus Society instead? But the idea that you have a sixth sense and all of your senses, can you imagine hearing? Can you imagine feeling? Can you imagine tasting? And they go through all of the existential sensory imaginings that you can have about Bible stories, because then all of a sudden it's not,
it's not anymore
not bad if it's a Bible story.
Yeah, but it's not any longer something distant, because you become a participant to the whole thing.
Yeah, the imagination
and that is really what people need to understand about the approach of Ignacio Loyola. The goal is not cognitive knowledge followed by healthy, reasonable application, but rather emotional involvement, because that is what is troublesome of his rules of discernment, of the Ignatian principles of foundation, of the kingdom exercises, the two standards, the three classes of people, the three kinds of humility, and the prayer, of course, take Lord. All this is part of a project to build a guy who is, of course, at that point under the control of this egregor, and it's working with a force to obtain something within the world on behalf, though, always of the Jesuit general, because that's what the chief, Ignacio Loyola was the first Jesuit general, but the ones that followed later on they are called superior, Father Superior General. They might not be, as the Knights Templars, former, like officially a military order that goes around with swords, but they are a military order in their discipline and in their way that they use education, and they also use education to write the narrative, and at the same time to spy and become the intelligent operatives par excellence of the Vatican.
Yeah, they want to be Jedi that control clone troopers in Star Wars. It's just you have all the clones.
I guess so. But in fact, the Jedi concept was imitated. George Lucas took it from a Gnostic concept, and Ignacio Loyola was a student of Gnosticism aside from Islamic mysticism, Kabbalah, and so on, because that's what the Alumbrados were. The Alumbrados was the sect that operated since the end of the 15th century in Spain, and was becoming a threat for the actual Vatican. So while living in this remote house in a place called Antesana, Loyola's interest in the occult grew, as well as his hypocritical religious zeal. And Loyola will gather young students to explain the gospel, teach them how to pray, but also sciences, like meaning like evoking spirits, hypnotizing young girls and boys, forcing them to lay on their knees with their arms crossed and their face filled with tears. This is all part of what Jesuitry does. So I think that people today in our show have had a brilliant insight also in parts of my book. Of course, this is it's a book that is for almost 400 pages. It's a book that you need to read because we can only scratch the surface in a limited time. But this book is a bestseller at the moment in historical essays, also in various religious categories. You can see that. And it's actually getting a lot of attention. And it's getting a lot of attention because this book is based on facts, not fiction, hard evidence. So when I'm always very meticulous with this kind of stuff. And in fact, at the end of the book, you have like 6 pages of no footnote citation that are all from credible sources. Because if you are facing the Jesuits, I mean, here you're talking about something like
sources, right?
755 footnotes and citations stuff. I mean, you have to be very down to the point. It's like Leo is no longer the guy who was simply bringing you out to the first level of the pyramid. Leo is bringing you right to the top of the pyramid after risking his life. As you know, since I started my whole confession series, I was forced to leave Italy. I was forced to even change my citizenship. And now I hope that with the last installment of my confessions, people have a full perspective of the reality of the Illuminati rather than the myth.
Right. Yeah, the current existing practical example of the group. I know we're at the end of the hour, and I didn't want to like make you stay longer, but you gave us so much about the history, and you've told us kind of to be warned about this new woke pope. What do you think is the play of the new Pope Leo? Like, do you have kind of a thought about what's coming?
I can, of course, give you a brief thought about what is coming. We are talking about Francis 2.0 on steroids, who was part of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, who will push, of course, the most leftist ideas possible and imaginable. He is very much a guy who is being elected to be a pain in the ass for Donald J. Trump, MAGA, and Trumpism, because he is actually already, even before becoming Pope, getting into an argument with both Catholic J.D. Vance, who became Catholic in August 2019, still thinking that maybe the traditional Catholics still had a chance because,
he's a Marine,
No, but listen,
the Marines or the Jesuits, like, best idea.
No, but aside from that, and I don't want to get into the intellectual capacity of people, you might be attracted to the traditional side of Catholicism because I stay a Catholic, and I know that those 100 priests who went to Mar-a-Lago, exorcised the place, brought them a statue of the Virgin Mary, they are genuine. But when it comes to administration, they will never be back in charge of the Vatican. The Vatican has been taken over, and they need to just accept that, They can't just live with the illusion, the Holy Spirit is going to bring us another good Pope. Listen, guys, it's a rigged system. If I elect 80% of the cardinals and 75 is the quorum to announce a new Pope, you have your own Pope. And then, like this morning, I was always making interviews in the last few days taking the piss, saying, these people are only in Rome to eat and they love the conclave for cooking. Well, this morning, if you go and see the conference given in front of the American journalists, at the end of the conference, they start talking about the gnocchi that were cooked during the conclave as the great food of the nuns, the Jesuitess. So, guys, when Leo Zagami is telling you about tortellini, and gnocchi, food, and of course, the Zagami family cookbook on Amazon.
I gotta need to get that one. I didn't know you had that one. That's actually pretty bomb right there. That's pretty fire.
This is serious stuff, including making your own tortellini, your own.
That's
gnocchi.
Pretty wild, actually. I mean, that's pretty. You guys don't understand how important this is. This is as important as the secrets of the Illuminati.
Absolutely. You're talking about the secret of the Illuminati, but actually there's even an Illuminati pasta.
See, the thing is, the Illuminati eat pasta. The Mafia eat pasta. You have to understand, this is like, I'm really excited. I'm going to get that book, Yeah, it's pretty sweet.
And it's worth it. It's worth it. And you can also try, Leo's Illuminati pasta.
Oh my God.
Aside from many other things, but my wife makes a wonderful recipe. And the famosi gnocchi of my wife, this is very good gnocchi. Now, I said to my wife this morning, do you think that the gnocchi of the conclave were better than yours? Now, my wife said, I doubt it, because they don't really have God on their side.
Oh my gosh.
Well, guys, thank you so much for having me on. God bless you, Andreas. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. We'll see you next time, and thanks for writing that book. Everybody, make sure you go to leozagami.com so you can check out his new book, Confessions of Illuminati 12, the final installment of this particular legacy. And yes, Leo Zagami is just the coolest dude ever. Thank you for being here, man.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Always a pleasure.